Not all boundaries are created equal. In fact, many boundaries, or lack thereof, are not boundaries, but defenses, punishments, and shame reactions. But how can you tell the difference? Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Wackett. Thanks for joining me for another video as we work to empower and equip you with the confidence and skills to write your own story so that you can live a life on purpose. Today we're going to talk about the difference between healthy and unhealthy boundaries and how to spot and set them. But before we can talk about healthy or unhealthy, we need to define what a boundary is. In case you missed it, my last two videos have also been on boundaries, taking a deeper dive into what they are and what makes them so challenging. I put a link in the show notes to each of these videos so that you can check them out before you go forward here, or make sure that you hit them up after this video. But for now, boundaries are the limits that we set with ourselves and others. Boundaries aim to ease tension, eliminate confusion, and allow our life design to align with our values, wants, and needs. They show up in what we say, how we structure our time and physical space, and the limits that we impose in different roles and responsibilities. I mean, it sounds easy, right? But as the title suggests, not all boundaries are created equal. A healthy boundary considers your wants and needs without dismissing those of other people. They affirm our sense of self and don't depend on the response of others to validate our right to set or maintain our boundaries. That may not mean that the other party gets what they want at all times, but the boundary is not an attempt to minimize that. The boundary is set to support your well-being and recognizes that you and the other party both have a right to your feelings while still honoring a boundary. So for example, I might set boundaries around when I check email or when I'm going to respond to text messages. The boundary gets communicated to others so that they're aware. There may be time others are annoyed or frustrated if I'm not on my email or texting people more. A healthy boundary doesn't dismiss their right to be upset, and this is not about them. I set this boundary for myself, to protect my well-being, to put boundaries on when I'm in a work headspace, and how I can show up in these contexts. This boundary makes space to honor that others can be on their email as much as they want. They can email me whenever they want. And this is my own principle and practice to support me. Healthy boundaries affirm our sense of self. Healthy boundaries are rooted in self-confidence and efficacy. Healthy boundaries are also flexible and context-specific. They set foundations and general principles but can shift if needed. The critical difference in flexibility versus erosion goes back to the first point. Flexibility still makes space to value your needs, wants, and values while also making space for others. Boundary erosion is about letting go of your boundary to dismiss your wants, needs, and values. So for example, a flexible boundary shows up in how I parent Everly. We're very intentional with when and how often we use absolute words like always or never or not at all. If I tell her that she can never do or have something, that's setting a clear-cut, very rigid boundary, which in some cases are important, like she can't shove anything into an electrical socket ever or eat animal poop ever. But outside of safety things, almost nothing exists in these extremes. She gets to watch one 30-minute show a week, most weeks. That's a boundary we have in our home around television and electronics. And most weeks, again, we follow this. And when she got croup, she watched 4 to 5 episodes in one night. When she took her first airplane ride, she got to watch more. The general principle or boundary is still consistent, but it's flexible in the context of what's going on in our lives. And finally, healthy boundaries are also about our response to other people's boundaries. Can we make space for it and honor it when someone says no or asserts a boundary? We might still be upset. We get to validate that. But are we able to respect the boundaries of other people? Can we hold space for our own beliefs, opinions, and values in hearing those of others? Can we listen to others and allow them to have their own thoughts, feelings, and ideas, even if they're contrary to our own, without eroding or silencing ours, or using them as a means to dominate over other people? And can we engage in appropriate sharing within all of this and considering all these aspects and contexts? Overall, the ability to set healthy boundaries requires self-love and efficacy, distress tolerance, and a high degree of shame resilience. Now, in contrast, unhealthy boundaries are rigid and inflexible, often power-driven, meaning we assert dominance or assume a subservient position, and involve a disregard for your own or others' values, wants, and needs. This can look like a myriad of different things, one of which could be setting a boundary and then walking it back, the first sign of pushback. So for example, if you tell someone that a project is outside of your scope, but once they ask a few more times, you say, okay, I'll take it on. Or telling someone what you need from them in a relationship, but then you dismiss it under the guise of being too needy or dramatic. It could also look like drawing a line in the sand that says you can't ever talk to someone who doesn't believe or think X. This frequently happens on social media as we've seen increasingly polarizing effects of politics and beliefs. While this might feel safe and necessary, and honestly it is true sometimes, these rigid lines are lines of reactivity derived from the growing anxiety, shame, and trauma we've experienced. All or nothing, yes or no responses lose sight of collaborative problem solving and community inclusive decision making, and make it so only X people are good and then Y people are bad. Unhealthy boundaries can also be taking responsibility for what's not yours. This shows up a lot when we get stuck in a cycle of shame and assume the role of being responsible for and doing it all for everyone else, as if something could go wrong, then it's all on us. This is an erosion of boundaries of personal responsibility and control. And finally, unhealthy boundaries assume or bulldoze past consent. This includes sexual or touching or forcing contact without permission or explicit consent, and physical contact like touching someone without their permission. I see this a lot with little kids and people saying, oh, give me a hug, or give X a hug goodbye. Even in the park, when Everly asks someone for a high five and their caregiver says, well, give her a high five. That simple phrase is an erosion of a boundary. What if they don't want to, or they don't feel safe? Everly isn't owed a high five because she asks for it. She'll be okay if your kid says no. And the people who want a hug or high five from her are not owed one because they want it. She gets to make that choice for herself. Consider the bulldozing in the context of COVID, how this has happened for you and what other ways you've seen people interact without consent. Be sure to go beyond physical and sexual spaces as well. So for example, how often are you asked for permission before your doctor's appointment starts 30 to 45 minutes late? How often is consent sought before sharing something deeply personal or detailed? So, okay, as you've gone through this, the question now becomes, do I have healthy boundaries? The short answer is probably not. Most people don't. And as you started to see above, shame, fear, self-doubt, and limiting beliefs all get in the way of setting healthy boundaries, which means that this isn't a you problem. This is something that we've all been conditioned to feel that we can work through over time. Since these experiences are universal, we're all at risk for boundary disruption and erosion. Plus, honestly, none of us has ever lived in a pandemic, which has been a major stressor and a dismantling of our boundaries in so many ways. So I say this because we tend to judge ourselves as we develop insight. But judgment demands punishment, which does nothing but perpetuate our shame. Instead, let's just accept for now that maybe we're not setting the healthiest boundaries. You have unhealthy boundaries, you're doing what you can to evolve, pivot, and grow. So how can we know for sure? How do we assess our boundaries either now or in the future to kind of check in if they are healthy or unhealthy? Well, in addition to some of the things that we mentioned above, one big point to consider when it comes to whether or not you have healthy boundaries is if they're working for you and allowing you to live a life you're excited about and can thrive in. Ultimately, everyone will set and maintain different boundaries. What might work for me might not work for you. What may look healthy for you might not be healthy for me. Here are just a couple yellow or red flags that I think is important to consider, regardless of, again, what your boundaries might look like. So the first question is to ask, do you lack your own identity? One outside of a specific role or with another person. So this occurs when we define ourselves or others by what they do or who they're connected to. For example, are you known as a marketing guru, X's spouse, Y's caregiver, or are you seen as a whole person and identified as such, celebrated for who you are and not just what you do or the one role you're in? A lack of boundaries is often correlated with wrapping up our view of ourselves into just one element of our lives. This may be us pouring our time into our work because we feel like we should, and then it becomes our sole identity or purpose. Another question to ask is, are you settling for good enough or fine? Are you under the belief that this is all you deserve, or that this predictably crappy relationship or role is not that big of a deal? The number of times we tell ourselves we're or should be fine is comical and is one of the primary webs of shame that we get caught in. These beliefs stem from the idea that if we dare reach for something better or ask for what we need, there are just going to be too many consequences. So professionally, you might be thinking, oh, if I ask for what I need, I might get fired. Or if I'm not working 60 plus hours a week, they won't think I'm committed to the job or give me a promotion. Personally, you might tell yourself, it could be worse. At least they don't blank. Or no one's ever really happy anyway. Or I never really wanted X. Another point to consider is if you've ever experienced role or responsibility confusion. Are you taking on responsibility for things that aren't yours and at your own expense? Or oppositely, are you pushing the burden of your life and happiness on everyone else to shift blame and attention? This happens a lot, and no surprises here, it's also connected to shame. Either we believe we have to do it all to prove our worth, or we make it everybody else's responsibility and problem to protect ourselves from feeling like we've failed. But both sides of this pendulum lead to the same destination, of feeling lonely, disconnected in our relationships, resentful, and deepening our shame narrative. So as you go through some of this, if you're unclear if this is still happening, the answer is almost unanimously yes. We all struggle with this to some degree. But to get clear on what it might look like for you, take some time and write down all the roles and relationships in your life and ask yourself where you may be taking on more or less than what's yours to carry. Sometimes this presents itself as multitasking or overextending. So for example, are you still checking your work email when you're with your family? When you're in a work meeting or a training, are you trying to catch up on other work? When you take time for self-care, are you engaging in other tasks for others at the same time? One of the most significant ways I see this presenting itself for people is in playing the role of nurturer or rescuer. So what does this mean? It means that we take on responsibility of fixing everyone and everything around us to ensure that others are okay, and again, often at our own expense. It means we overextend or cross boundaries in our roles and connections to try and be everything that person needs or that we perceive them to need. So this could look like you maybe taking on the role of a caregiver for your partner, or becoming that sort of person in place of a therapist for a coworker. Another question to ask yourself is if you're living under the someday fantasy. This is a belief that undermines our ability to take action in our own lives to create a life we can thrive in. We tell ourselves that unhappiness or exhaustion or these extra responsibilities and time are temporary, and that someday things will get better. But guess what? Nothing changes unless we change it. Why would someone ask for less when you're willing to give so much? Why would I settle for less work being done when you give me more output? The person benefiting from your over will not be the one willing to take less unless you ignite that change. This means that, unfortunately, the burden of responsibility is on you to change, set the boundary, and deal with your own and others' distress as they adjust to it. Now, I know this is a lot for you to think about. Trust me, I get it, and every time I think about this work, I'm reminded of the growth opportunities I have within my boundaries, which reminds me that this work is never done. Our boundaries, needs, and wants are constantly changing. So we have to reflect on them, and often and again, and we need to ask ourselves the most important question: how are they working for you? Remember, I can give you ideas, I can give you reflections, I can give you concepts, but what works for me might look different for you. So it's important that you take that time to really consider it against your own values, your own wants and needs. So as you consider your next steps and takeaways, I want you to think about the following. What's coming up for me as I'm thinking about my boundaries in my personal and professional life? Where do they come from? How are they working for me? Which yellow flags are present for me, and how can I shift my mindset? What do I have to work through or pass to do this? As you all know, writing things down and sharing them out loud is one of the best ways to increase our buy-in and reinforce the work that we're doing. So leave a comment below with one of the reflections that you've come up with, just moving through this video or from some of these questions. And if you have your own questions or wonderings, please list those as well so that I can help you and support you either in the responses with new video content or in any other way that I can serve you. And if you have a painful insight you need some help on getting to those next steps, remember, you're worth sharing your story and asking for help. Be sure to take a look at the video notes to get the links to the other boundary videos I mentioned. And if you like what you're hearing, click subscribe to save yourself the time and energy to check back for content and get an alert whenever there's new awesomeness to check out. And if you want to stay in the know on all of the happenings of Adversity Rising, plus get access to exclusive content I don't share anywhere else, sign up for my email list with the link in the bio. Thank you so much for being here with me today. This is a really hard topic, and for many of us, some hard insight to have to swallow. Just remember, you have the right to author your own story. So let's go get that pen back.